It is perhaps the most famous unfinished construction project in human history, a structure of such immense ambition that it supposedly provoked the wrath of God himself. We all know the story. In the book of Genesis, humanity, united by one language, migrates to the land of Shinar. They say to one another, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens." They wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted immortality in brick. But the story ends in disaster. God comes down, confuses their language, and scatters them across the face of the earth. The tower is abandoned. The city is left silent. For centuries, historians and theologians treated this purely as a parable, a moral lesson about hubris, a fairy tale to explain why we speak different languages. But here is the truth that is often left out of Sunday school. The tower was real. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was a massive engineering reality located in the heart of the ancient metropolis of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. We have the bricks. We have the eyewitness accounts from Greek historians, and most importantly, we have the writings of the king who actually finished it. We don't need to guess what happened. We can read the blueprints. Today we are going to treat the Bible not just as a religious text, but as a historical crime scene. We are going to dig through the dust of Mesopotamia to separate the myth from the mud brick reality. We will discover how this tower was built without stone, why it was destroyed, and if it really did play a role in the confusion of human language. Forget the fairy tale. This is the story of the very first skyscraper and the rise and fall of the first true world power. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world. So let me know below. Genesis tells the Babel story with almost no extra decoration, like a short report that trusts the reader to feel the weight on their own. It begins with a simple line: "The whole earth had one language and the same words," a single shared way of speaking that makes the group feel like one body. Then people migrate and settle in the land of Shinar, a name that sounds mysterious until you realize it points toward a real kind of place, the southern Mesopotamian world of river plains, where early cities rose out of clay and water. Many historians connect Shinar with Sumer, or the wider region later called Babylonia, not because Genesis gives a modern map, but because the details fit that landscape so well. The builders don't talk like dreamers, they talk like planners. "Come on," they say, "let's make bricks and bake them hard, and let's use bitumen as mortar." That is exactly the technology of a land with plenty of mud and natural tar, but very little building stone, and it makes the scene feel physical, smoky, and hot, like a real yard full of drying bricks. Then they announce the goal, and the wording matters. "Build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." That last line is the heartbeat. The tower is not only about height, it's about fear. Fear of dispersing, fear of being forgotten, fear that the group will dissolve into distance and nobody will remember their story as one story. The city and the tower are supposed to pin them in place and turn unity into something you can point at from miles away. The phrase, "with its top in the heavens," is easy to hear as a literal attempt to attack the sky, But in ancient speech, it also works as a natural way to say extremely tall, a monument that claims sacred importance by rising above everything else. In a flat world, height becomes a kind of authority. Height says, this is the center, this is the place where order lives. The narrative then turns with a quiet irony. Humans build upward, and God comes down to see what they are doing. The wording shrinks the tower without needing to mock it openly. From the builder's view, it's a mountain of brick. From God's view, it's something you have to lean in to inspect. And what God says is one of the most revealing lines in the whole passage, because it's not about human weakness, it's about human effectiveness. They are one people, God observes. They have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. The danger here is coordination, the power of a unified project that can scale. Then comes the intervention, and it's surprisingly precise. God doesn't smash the tower with fire. He confuses their language so they can't understand each other, and the building stops because the social glue stops. It's a story where the real point of failure is not material, it's meaning. Once words stop landing, work stops, trust frays, arguments multiply, and the crowd breaks into smaller groups that drift away. The result is exactly what the builders feared most: scattering. That's where the theological angle tightens. Earlier in Genesis, humanity is told to fill the earth, to spread life outward. The Babel plan runs in the opposite direction, trying to concentrate people into one place and one name, like a refusal to let the world become wide. Some readers call that pride, and it can be, but it also reads like control, the desire to build a single safe center so nothing unpredictable can happen. And the story suggests that kind of unity, when it's driven by fear of dispersion, becomes its own trap. It also helps to notice what the text does not say. Genesis 11 never names a king. It never says Nimrod built the tower. Nimrod appears earlier, tied to early kingdoms and to Babel as a city, and later tradition often welds him into this story as the strong organizer behind the project, because people naturally imagine a massive state construction site needing a central will. But the silence in Genesis is meaningful. The builders speak as a crowd, not as subjects taking orders, and that makes the story less about one villain and more about a shared human impulse. By the end, Babel is not just a place, it's a name stamped onto an event, a memory of human unity breaking into misunderstanding. It explains something about why people scatter, why cooperation is fragile, and why a monument can't guarantee a future. And it leaves a question hanging in the air that the rest of the journey has to answer. If Shinar points to a real world of brick-built cities, what kind of tower would listeners have pictured when they heard these lines? And what real monument might be standing behind the silhouette of the myth? One of the first questions people ask after reading the Babel story is also the question the text refuses to answer: who was in charge? A tower that huge doesn't usually rise from a casual neighborhood meeting, so readers instinctively go looking for a leader, a builder, a name to pin the ambition on. And that's exactly where Nimrod walks into the conversation, not from Genesis 11 itself, but from the chapter right before it. In Genesis 10, Nimrod is introduced as a mighty figure, described in a way that sounds like an early strongman, a powerful hunter, a person whose reputation spreads. The text also connects him with the beginnings of a kingdom and with major places in Mesopotamia. And among the names that appear in that list is Babel. So even though Genesis never says Nimrod built the tower, many later readers treated the connection as almost obvious. If Nimrod is linked to Babel the city, and Babel the city later becomes linked to a tower, then Nimrod becomes the natural candidate to stand behind the project, the kind of ruler who could gather labor and keep a massive build going. Over time, that suspicion hardens into tradition. In later Jewish interpretation, and then in Christian and Islamic storytelling in different forms, Nimrod often becomes more than a founder. He becomes a symbol, the archetype of the proud king who tries to rival God, the kind of person who would love the idea of a tower that reaches the heavens and secures a name forever. But if we're trying to read Genesis carefully, the interesting point is the gap itself. The story of Babel is told without a king on purpose, and that choice changes the meaning. The builders speak as a collective, repeating the phrase, "Come, let us," like a crowd talking itself into a plan. It feels communal, almost democratic in its tone, even if the reality of ancient building projects usually involved hierarchy. That creates a different kind of warning. If the story named a tyrant, listeners could blame the disaster on one bad man, one villain, one corrupt ruler. By leaving the leader unnamed, the text places the impulse inside the group. It suggests that the hunger for a permanent name, the fear of scattering, and the desire to secure unity through a monument aren't only the habits of kings, they're temptations that can belong to everyone. At the same time, the Nimrod tradition doesn't come out of nowhere. In the real ancient Near East, the biggest projects almost always require authority. Someone has to allocate resources, organize labor, enforce schedules, and keep the workforce moving when enthusiasm fades. Temples and towers are not just faith, they're administration. So when later readers imagine a strong organizer behind Babel, they're also responding to how ancient cities actually functioned. The question becomes less, did Nimrod literally sign the orders, and more, what does Nimrod represent in the imagination of later communities? He represents the person who turns collective ambition into a machine. He represents the moment when a city stops being a settlement and becomes a kingdom, when power concentrates, when builders become workers, and when a monument becomes a political statement as much as a sacred one. That also helps explain why Nimrod grows larger in retellings. A king gives the story a face. He gives pride a voice, he gives the tower a sponsor, and sponsors are how giant structures get built. But Genesis chooses a different angle. It focuses on the crowd and the shared language, because the core drama is not simply that one ruler gets arrogant, it's that a whole society decides to root itself in one place and one project, almost as if unity is worth any price. So Nimrod sits at the edge of the story like a shadow figure, not in the original scene, but in the memory of readers who know that empires don't build themselves. And that tension is useful for us because it keeps us honest. It reminds us that part of this tale is scripture, part is tradition, and part is history, and the three can overlap without being identical. When we move forward into the real world behind Shinar, we'll see why the idea of a king builder feels so plausible, and why a tower could become the perfect monument for a ruler who wanted the world to remember his name. To understand why the Babel story feels so grounded, you have to take Shinar seriously as more than a stage name. Genesis doesn't say Mesopotamia, because that's a later Greek label, but Shinar carries the smell of the same world, a broad alluvial plain shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, where cities depended on canals, where fields had to be managed like machines, and where the landscape was built as much by human labor as by nature. Many scholars link Shinar with the southern Mesopotamian region connected to Sumer and later Babylonia, and while that identification is a reconstruction rather than a direct quote from the text, it fits the cultural furniture perfectly. This is not mountain country, it's river country. The ground is clay, the horizon is flat. The most dramatic features are the waterways, the levees, the canals that carry life and can also bring disaster. In that setting, settlement changes what it means to be human. To understand why the Babel story feels so grounded, you have to take Shinar seriously as more than a stage name. Genesis doesn't say Mesopotamia, because that's a later Greek label, but Shinar carries the smell of the same world, a broad alluvial plain shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, where cities depended on canals, where fields had to be managed like machines, and where the landscape was built as much by human labor as by nature. Many scholars link Shinar with the southern Mesopotamian region connected to Sumer and later Babylonia, and while that identification is a reconstruction rather than a direct quote from the text, it fits the cultural furniture perfectly. This is not mountain country, it's river country. The ground is clay, the horizon is flat. The most dramatic features are the waterways, the levees, the canals that carry life and can also bring disaster. In that setting, settlement changes what it means to be human. A mobile life can follow pasture and water. A city has to hold water, store grain, schedule labor, defend its walls, keep records, and coordinate thousands of people who aren't all related by family. That shift produces new inventions, not only physical tools, but social ones, administrators, scribes, standardized measures, and rituals that bind the community together. And once you have that kind of city life, you also have a new kind of anxiety. A city can feel like safety, but it can also feel like a trap. It can concentrate power, concentrate resources, and concentrate identity until the city itself becomes the main story people tell about who they are. In other words, when Genesis describes a group arriving in Shinar and immediately thinking in terms of a city and a monumental tower, it's describing a mindset that fits early Mesopotamian urbanization, the urge to turn a vulnerable human population into something stable, organized, and memorable. The brick detail in Genesis is one of the reasons Shinar points south. In many parts of the ancient Near East, stone is available, at least in workable quantities. But in the southern alluvial plain, stone is scarce and heavy to import, so clay becomes the foundation of almost everything. You mold it, you dry it, sometimes you fire it, and you build thick walls that can hold back heat and time as long as you keep repairing them. Bitumen, a natural asphalt that seeps from the ground in the region, becomes the glue that makes certain structures more durable, especially where moisture is a threat. That's why brick and bitumen isn't just a random technical note, it's a fingerprint of place. The kind of phrase that would ring true to someone who knew this landscape. Shinar also makes sense in the wider biblical imagination because it sits at a crossroads in memory. Mesopotamia is the land of the great early city-states and empires, the land of kings, temples, archives, and forced migrations. And later Israelite writers often looked at it with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. It's a place where human organization reaches impressive scale, but also where scale can become oppression. The Babel story, told as a myth of a city that tries to hold humanity in one place, fits that tension. It doesn't need to name Babylon yet, it only needs to name the kind of land where such a city would be plausible. Once you picture Shinar correctly, the tower stops sounding like a fairy tale structure floating in the clouds and starts sounding like something that could rise out of this exact mud, built by people who learned to turn clay into permanence and to turn a flat plain into a skyline. And that sets up the next step, because Shinar doesn't just point to a region, it points toward a specific architectural tradition that made the ancient world look up. Start with the problem the builders of southern Mesopotamia faced every day. The land is generous, but it's also unforgiving. The rivers give you fertile soil, but they also flood, shift, and destroy, and the ground you build on is mostly clay that turns soft when it stays wet and cracks when it dries. There's also the simple fact of the horizon. In a flat plain, nothing rises naturally to tell you where the sacred center is, and nothing high enough exists to pull the eye upward the way a mountain does in other parts of the world. So people made their own mountain. That's the basic logic of the ziggurat, the signature tower of Mesopotamian cities, a staged structure built in stacked levels, broad at the bottom and rising step by step, with a temple or shrine at the top. If you only know the Babel story in its later popular form, you might imagine a tower designed to storm heaven, like a weapon aimed at God. But in the religious world that produced ziggurats, the idea is often the reverse. The tower marks a place where the divine can be welcomed, where the city stages a connection between earth and sky, not by attacking the heavens, but by building a sacred high place and treating it as a meeting point. In a landscape without mountains, height becomes a kind of language. It says, "This city has a center." It says, "This city has a god." It says, "This city has order." And because it's visible from far away, it also works like a beacon, a way to navigate toward the place where festivals, offerings, and authority converge. Now add the material reality, because this is where the story becomes tactile. In much of southern Mesopotamia, there was little stone to quarry nearby, so builders relied on clay. They shaped mud into bricks, dried them under the sun, fired the most important bricks in kilns for strength, and used mud mortar or bitumen to bind and seal. This means a tower is not just a bold design, it's a supply chain. You need clay pits, molds, drying yards, fuel for kilns, transport routes, ramps, storage, supervisors, and a calendar that tells you when the ground is firm enough and the weather dry enough to work. A ziggurat is also a commitment to maintenance. Mud brick is strong, but it wants to return to earth, and wind and rain never stop negotiating with it. So, a city that keeps a tower standing is proving something about itself. It can coordinate labor, not only to build, but to repair, to reface, to drain, to patch, to keep the edges sharp and the surfaces sealed. That's why a great tower becomes more than a religious symbol. It becomes a demonstration of administration, the visible proof that the city can organize thousands of people around one shared task. It also explains why towers sit so naturally at the intersection of worship and power. The temple complex in ancient Mesopotamia isn't only a quiet spiritual corner, it's tied to the life of the city, to festivals, to offerings, to storage, to scribal work, to the ruler's public legitimacy. So when a city builds high, it is doing several things at once. It is honoring the divine, it is marking the city's identity, it is displaying wealth and unity, and it is projecting a message outward, because a tower is a billboard that cannot be ignored. That helps the Genesis language land with a different weight. "Let us make bricks" sounds like an ordinary plan, but it also sounds like the beginning of urban society becoming a machine. Let us make a name sounds like pride, but it also sounds like a city's fear of being scattered, a desire to anchor itself in one place and one monument. In that light, the Babel story doesn't have to be read as anti-technology. It can be heard as suspicious of a certain kind of unity, the kind that tries to turn human cooperation into an unbreakable structure and treats a monument as insurance against the future. A ziggurat is the perfect image for that tension because it's both devotional and administrative, both sacred and civic, both a staircase and a statement. It's the city made vertical. And once you understand that, you're ready to see why one particular tower in one particular city could grow so large in the imagination that it swallowed all other towers into a single name, Babel. To really feel why the Tower of Babel became such a sticky image, it helps to step into Babylon as a city, not as a symbol. Imagine approaching from the plain, where the land is wide and the sky feels close, and then the horizon starts to break into geometry, walls, towers, gates, straight lines that look unnatural in a landscape made by rivers. Babylon was famous for its defenses and its scale, and for the way it staged power through architecture, not in a hidden way, but right out in the open. Entering the city was not like slipping into a village, it was more like passing through layers, moving from outer space into controlled space, from fields into streets, from wandering into a place that tells you where to go. Inside, the city's sacred center was not a single building, but a whole district of meaning, where temple, tower, ceremony, and administration were woven together. The main temple complex, traditionally associated with the god Marduk, is often called the Esagila, and it mattered because in Babylon the city's identity and the city's theology were tightly linked. The temple wasn't just a quiet room for private prayer, it was a public center with storage, personnel, schedules, festivals, and a calendar that structured the year. Offerings came in, processions went out, rituals marked time, and the ruler's legitimacy was tied to his role as a builder and caretaker of the gods' houses. In that kind of world, rebuilding a temple is not just renovation, it's a claim that order has been restored and that the city's relationship with the divine is stable again. Near that temple heart stood the ziggurat, Etemenanki, and it's important to picture the relationship correctly. The tower was not a random skyscraper placed wherever there was room. It was part of a designed sacred landscape where movement, sightlines, and ceremony mattered. The tower's mass would have been visible from far away, but up close it also functioned as a landmark that organized space around it, telling you what the center of the city was before anyone said a word. And Babylon was the kind of place where the city center was designed to be experienced. There were broad routes used for major processions, including the famous ceremonial avenue later writers describe, where festivals could turn architecture into theater, with crowds watching the movement of priests, officials, and sacred images through gates and along walls. The Ishtar date, with its glazed brick and animal reliefs, is a reminder of what the Neo-Babylonian kings wanted Babylon to look like, not just large, but polished, colored, and intentional, a city that didn't only function, it performed. The color and shine mattered because they made power feel permanent, like the city had been built to resist time itself. Now bring that back to the Babel story's emotional core, making a name and refusing to scatter. Babylon is exactly the kind of city that can tempt people with that dream because it makes unity visible. You can stand in a crowd and feel part of something bigger simply because the buildings around you insist that something bigger exists. The walls say organization, the gates say control, the temple precinct says sacred centrality, and the tower says height, connection, and permanence all at once. It's also the kind of environment where the phrase "top in the heavens" stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like everyday exaggeration from someone who has never seen anything like this before. In a flat country, a staged tower doesn't need to be truly infinite to feel otherworldly. It only needs to dominate everything your eyes are used to measuring. Babylon's scale also explains why later memory treats it as a magnet for nations. Imperial capitals pull people in for ordinary reasons and for harsh reasons. Merchants come because markets are bigger. Artisans come because commissions exist. Administrators come because paperwork lives there. Soldiers come because orders come from there. Captives and resettled communities arrive because empires move populations like resources. The result is a city where many languages can be heard without anyone needing to invent a miracle. It's a place where translation becomes a job, where scribes become essential, where accents mark outsiders, and where misunderstanding is part of the daily texture of life. That matters because it makes the Babel story's confusion feel psychologically realistic, even if the story tells it as a sudden event. In a city like Babylon, language difference is already a force that has to be managed, and if that management breaks down, work breaks down with it. There's another layer too, and it's easy to miss if you only picture the tower as a religious object. A ziggurat is labor made visible. It represents huge quantities of clay gathered, shaped, dried, fired, hauled, stacked, and sealed. And that implies authority, because voluntary enthusiasm alone rarely sustains multi-year projects on that scale. Even when a king frames the work as devotion, the build still requires administration, quotas, supervisors, and a flow of resources that only a powerful center can guarantee. So the tower and the temple precinct together become a kind of billboard for the state, proof that the city can command the landscape, command labor, and command attention. And because Babylon was so famous, its sacred center became a reference point even for people who had never been there. Stories travel faster than travelers. A visitor sees the city, returns home, and the description grows in the telling. A captive is taken there, later remembers it through the ache of displacement, and the city becomes a symbol of concentrated power. A trader passes through and talks about the walls, the gates, the crowds, and the tower that seems to stand above all of it, and listeners attach those images to their own fears and hopes. In that sense, the tower becomes more than an object in Babylon. It becomes a portable idea, the image of a human world so organized and so confident that it looks like it might outlast everyone who built it. That's why it makes sense that the biblical story doesn't waste time describing apartments, markets, or canals. It doesn't need to. It selects the most charged elements of an imperial city and turns them into a tight narrative. One language, one project, one center, one monument meant to secure a name. And once Babylon is seen not as a vague ancient city, but as a carefully staged capital where sacred space and state power reinforce each other, the next step becomes unavoidable. If this is the kind of place that could generate a story like Babel, then Etemenanki isn't just a candidate tower in the abstract, it's the centerpiece of a city built to feel like the center of the world, and its history will tell us how a real structure can feed a myth that refuses to die. If you're trying to find the real-world tower that best fits the silhouette behind the Babel story, one structure keeps pulling the evidence toward itself: the great ziggurat of Babylon, called Etemenanki. Many researchers treat it as the strongest historical candidate, not because anyone unearthed a tablet that says this is the tower from Genesis, but because the overlap is stubborn. The region is right, the building type is right, the city is the one ancient people most associated with grand scale, and the monument's name itself sounds like the kind of phrase that could echo into scripture. Etemenanki is often explained as house of the foundation of heaven and earth, and even if you don't over-literalize that translation, the intention is clear. This was meant to be the architectural hinge of the city, a structure that symbolically ties the human world to the divine world, making Babylon's sacred center visible in the skyline. It also wasn't a standalone tower dropped into an empty field. It belonged to a temple landscape, paired with the main sanctuary at Babylon's heart. And that pairing matters because the tower's meaning is amplified when it stands beside the place where the god is worshipped, where festivals are organized, where ritual calendars are kept, and where kings present themselves as caretakers of order. In other words, the tower isn't only about height, it's about the claim that Babylon is anchored, stable, chosen, and central. Another important point is that Etemenanki was not a one-time project. Ziggurats tend to have long lives, with phases of repair, refacing, and rebuilding, because mud brick monuments survive by being continuously worked on, and because new rulers often prove themselves by restoring what earlier wars or neglect damaged. That creates a kind of biography. And biographies are exactly what myths like to borrow from. A tower that rose once and quietly decayed would be forgettable. A tower that is repeatedly damaged and spectacularly rebuilt becomes a story magnet. The first major rupture we can point to comes from imperial conflict. In the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, Babylon is caught in the struggle between local rule and the Assyrian Empire, a tug-of-war that turns the city into a political prize. In 689 BCE, after revolts, the Assyrian king Sennacherib destroys Babylon, and ancient sources describe a brutal devastation. Later Babylonian memory especially treats this as a kind of assault on the city's divine order, because smashing the sacred center is never just demolition, it's a statement about who gets to define reality. Whether we can reconstruct every detail of what happened to the tower in that moment is hard, but the broad point stands. The city's heart is broken. The symbolic center is interrupted, and rebuilding becomes an act of restoration with huge political weight. Then comes the reversal, and it's one of the reasons Etemenanki feels so close to the emotional logic of Babel. When the Neo-Babylonian dynasty rises, Nabopolassar begins restoring Babylon's sacred core, and his son Nebuchadnezzar II turns the project into an imperial performance. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't simply patch what is broken, he wants Babylon to look inevitable, like it is meant to sit at the center of the world, and he uses a language ancient rulers loved because it can be seen from miles away: building. Restoring the temples and the tower announces that the gods are present, that order has been re-established, and that the king has the resources to command labor at a scale that smaller cities can't even imagine. Think about what that means in practice. It means clay gathered in enormous quantities, bricks shaped and dried by the tens of thousands, fired bricks produced for outer layers, bitumen transported to seal and strengthen, ramps built and maintained, surfaces refaced, corners squared, drainage managed, and supervisors keeping the work moving day after day. A project like that doesn't depend on inspiration, it depends on administration. That is one reason later tradition instinctively wants a king behind the tower even when Genesis keeps the builders anonymous. Giant monuments are never just about vision, they're about control of time and bodies. And Babylon, under the Neo-Babylonians, was the kind of capital where that control was real. It drew in officials, merchants, specialists, soldiers, and also displaced communities, and the city's daily sound would have reflected that mixture. That's why phrases like "people from everywhere" aren't automatically mystical. In an imperial center, they describe what the street can look like. Now imagine standing in that world as a visitor. You've traveled across flat land, you enter a city that feels engineered, and in its sacred center you see a staged tower rising above everything, the human-made mountain that defines the skyline. It doesn't need to literally touch the sky to feel like it does. It only needs to dwarf every other structure you know. That's how a real building can feed the mythic line about a top in the heavens. It's also how a city can feed the theme of making a name. A tower like Etemenanki is reputation turned into architecture. It is the city saying, "We are permanent, we are chosen, we are not going to be scattered." And for a king like Nebuchadnezzar, it is also a way to pin his reign onto the skyline, because buildings keep repeating your message long after your voice is gone. So when people casually say, "This is the real Tower of Babel," the careful version is this: Etemenanki is the most prominent, best-attested tower that fits the geographic and cultural world the Babel story reflects, and its dramatic life, its breaking and rebuilding under great powers, gives it exactly the kind of history that a myth can compress into a single, unforgettable scene. The next step is to follow the evidence trail in detail, because with Etemenanki, we're not dealing only with imagination. We have names, we have royal claims, we have measurements preserved in later tradition, and we have the archaeology of a footprint so large it makes the legend feel less like a fantasy and more like a memory anchored in brick. To understand why Etemenanki mattered so much, you have to see what it meant when Babylon's sacred center was attacked. Because in the ancient world, you don't just defeat an army, you also try to break the city's relationship with its god. In the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, Babylon is repeatedly caught in conflict with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, with revolts, counter-revolts, shifting alliances, and long stretches of resentment on both sides. And by the time you reach 689 BCE, the tension has hardened into something brutal. Ancient accounts describe Sennacherib besieging Babylon and then sacking it, and what makes this episode stand out is not only that the city was taken, but that Sennacherib presents the destruction as total, almost theatrical, as if he wants to erase the idea of Babylon itself. In his royal inscriptions, he boasts about tearing down the walls, the temples, and the ziggurat, throwing huge quantities of brickwork into the Arak II Canal, and cutting watercourses through the city so that the site would be overwhelmed like land after a flood. Language that sounds less like ordinary conquest and more like a ritual unmaking of an enemy's center. That kind of claim doesn't automatically mean every part of every structure was physically reduced to nothing in the way a modern demolition crew could do it, and some historians are cautious about taking the total erasure rhetoric at face value. But even with caution, the message is clear. The sacred heart of Babylon was targeted and publicly humiliated. And this is where the story gets even more psychologically sharp, because it's not only buildings that matter in Babylonian religion, it's also the presence of the god in the city. represented through cult images and the rituals that move them through space at key festivals. Several traditions connect the destruction with the removal of Marduk's statue, and whether the statue taken was the original or a later replacement is debated, but the broader point is that Babylonians remembered this as more than looting. They remembered it as a violation, the kind of act that would make the city feel spiritually abandoned. That's why this episode matters so much for our larger story. It helps explain why rebuilding Babylon later becomes an obsession for new rulers, and why restoring the sacred center is not optional decoration, but a political and religious necessity. When Sennacherib dies in 621 BCE and his successor Esarhaddon takes power, the tone shifts because Esarhaddon has to govern Babylonia, not just punish it, and he also has to repair the damage his father's actions did to Assyria's legitimacy in the eyes of Babylonians. Esarhaddon's inscriptions and commemorative texts describe rebuilding Babylon and its great sanctuaries, and what's revealing is the way he frames it. He doesn't simply say, "I'm undoing what my father did." He often redirects blame into a safer space, presenting Babylon's destruction as something that happened because of divine anger at Babylon's own disorder, while he appears as the restorer chosen to set things right. That rhetorical move tells you how sensitive the wound was, because a king is trying to stitch the city back into order without publicly condemning the royal line that put him on the throne. At the same time, the rebuilding itself was not a quick patch. A city like Babylon is a system, and the sacred center is part of that system. So restoration means labor, materials, rituals, and time, and later sources suggest it took decades for Babylon to recover its full monumental life. This is also the moment where Etemenanki begins to feel like more than a building project. It becomes a symbol of whether Babylon is alive again. If the tower precinct is broken, the city's skyline is broken. The festivals lose their stage, and the claim that Babylon stands at the center of heaven and earth starts to sound hollow. So the stakes of reconstruction are huge, and that's why later kings, especially the Neo-Babylonians, will make the tower part of their identity, not only because it's tall, but because it repairs a historical trauma and turns recovery into spectacle. It's also why the Babel story, when read against this history, becomes even more charged. Genesis gives us a compact myth about a human project interrupted at its center, a city that loses its shared voice and scatters, and you can hear a faint echo of something real behind it. The ancient Near East knew what it meant for a city's center to be broken, and it knew that when a center breaks, people disperse, systems fail, and identity becomes unstable. In Babylon, the confusion wasn't a supernatural scrambling of grammar. It was the real chaos of empire, revolt, siege, exile, and rebuilding, with different peoples pulled into the same space by force and by policy, and with kings using monuments to declare that order has returned. So when we say the tower has a biography, this is one of its darkest chapters. The moment the sacred mountain is treated as rubble, the moment the city is made to feel erased, and the moment rebuilding becomes not just construction, but the act of refounding a world. After a city is broken the way Babylon was broken, rebuilding isn't just repair work, it's a public argument about who is allowed to rule the world. Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, begins that argument by restoring the sacred core, because if Babylon's temples are wounded, then Babylon's identity is wounded, and a new king needs the gods back in their proper place before he can look legitimate. But it's his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who turns restoration into something bigger, almost like a manifesto written in brick. He inherits a city that must be made whole, and he chooses to make it overwhelming. Walls become stronger, gates become brighter. The ceremonial routes through the city are rebuilt so that festivals can move through architecture like a story told in stone and color. And at the center of that whole staged image stands the tower precinct, because a rebuilt tower doesn't only rise upward, it tells everyone, including enemies and visitors, that Babylon has returned and that its God is enthroned again. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions are part of this performance. Ancient kings don't write modestly about construction. They describe it as cosmic maintenance, as if the stability of the universe depends on the work they sponsor. And the king presents himself as the one who restores the bond between heaven and earth. When he speaks about the great tower, the language is not about a clever building trick, it's about completing what must exist for the city to be itself. He talks about strong baked brick, about bitumen, about raising the structure, about making it shine, about doing the work in a way that fits the dignity of the gods. And underneath that religious tone, you can hear the administrative reality. This project required a machine. Clay had to be gathered in huge amounts. Bricks had to be stamped, dried, fired, and transported. Bitumen had to be hauled and managed like a strategic resource. Ramps had to be built and maintained. Teams had to be fed, paid, supervised, and scheduled around seasons, heat, and water. And that's where one line in the tradition becomes especially telling, the idea that the king gathered people from many lands for the work. You don't have to take that as a literal census claim to feel what it means. An imperial capital can draw in specialists and laborers from across its territory, and it can also move populations into place through policy and conquest. So a monumental site can become a meeting ground of accents and backgrounds, even when the official inscriptions wrap it all in grand, flattering language. In that sense, the rebuilding of the tower isn't just a building story, it's a social story. A city announces unity by putting many hands on one structure, and the structure then stands as proof that the unity existed, even if the unity was complicated and sometimes forced. This is also why Babylon's famous glazed brickwork matters more than it might seem at first. Color is not a side detail in a capital like this. Glazed surfaces, deep blues, stylized animals, clean lines, repeated patterns, all of it turns the city into a controlled visual environment, a place designed to impress the eye and calm the mind with the feeling that order is permanent. A tower rising from the sacred center, faced and maintained, would have been the ultimate version of that message, a man-made mountain that makes the city look like it belongs in the same category as the sky. And that connects directly to the emotional nerve in Genesis, the desire to make a name. Nebuchadnezzar is, in a very literal way, making a name in brick, because many bricks were stamped with royal marks, and public inscriptions attach the king's identity to the act of rebuilding, as if the skyline itself is a signature. Yet what makes this chapter of the story so fascinating is that it doesn't reduce neatly to either faith or ego. From one angle, rebuilding the tower and temple is devotion, the king presenting himself as the responsible caretaker who restores proper worship and repairs the relationship between the city and its god. From another angle, it is empire, because a ruler proves power by commanding labor, organizing resources, and making the capital feel like the center of the world. In Babylon, those angles overlap naturally because sacred order and political order are braided together. A stable city is a religious claim and an administrative achievement at the same time. And if you imagine standing in Babylon during the height of this rebuilding, you can feel why later memories would grow larger than life. You would see a city that looks rebuilt on purpose, not patched in desperation. You would walk routes meant for processions, past gates meant to dazzle, toward a sacred center meant to dominate the skyline. And you would understand, without reading a single inscription, that this place is trying to convince you it will never fall again. That is the moment when Etemenanki becomes more than a tower. It becomes Babylon's promise to itself, and Babylon's warning to everyone else. And once a building carries that much meaning, it doesn't take much for it to become the raw material of a myth. When you strip away the legend and ask what we can actually stand on, the case for Etemenanki rests on several kinds of evidence that don't all carry the same weight, but together start to point in the same direction. The first and most dependable layer is the royal building tradition itself, because Babylonian kings didn't just build, they documented building as part of ruling. Inscriptions were a way of making construction permanent, even when the structure itself might suffer damage, and they follow a recognizable pattern. The king names the monument, names the god, describes the materials, and frames the work as restoring cosmic order. With Nebuchadnezzar II, those texts are especially important because he is writing from the very era when Babylon is at its most self-confident and monumental, and he presents the tower precinct as a centerpiece, not an afterthought. You read these inscriptions knowing they are propaganda, but propaganda still has bones. A king can exaggerate his virtue, but he usually doesn't invent a major sacred landmark out of thin air, because too many people in the city would know what exists and what doesn't. The second layer is the technical-sounding tradition that preserves measurements and staged structure, most famously the text scholars often call the Esagila tablet, a document that describes the temple complex and the great tower in a way that feels closer to a schematic than a poem. It's not a modern blueprint, and it comes to us through later copying, which means you treat it with care, but it matters because it shows that ancient scribes remembered the tower as a structured, tiered monument with a scale that fits the kind of skyline shock the Babel story trades on. The third layer comes from outsiders, especially Greek and later classical writers, who describe Babylon and its great tower precinct as something worth mentioning, sometimes with details that are clearly filtered through hearsay and travel narrative habits, and sometimes with observations that ring true because they match what we know of Mesopotamian monumental forms. These accounts are not neutral either. They carry their own agendas and misunderstandings, but they tell you something crucial. Even in later centuries, visitors and readers still associated Babylon with a massive tower temple, as if the city's identity and that structure were fused in memory. Then there is archaeology, which is the least dramatic in terms of skyline, but often the most honest in terms of scale. Archaeology doesn't usually give you a standing tower in a mud brick landscape. It gives you footprints, foundation cuts, platform outlines, and the geometry of space that a monument demanded. And when you see how large the base had to be, you begin to understand how the tower could dominate imagination even after its upper stages were stripped away. Finally, there are the controversial exhibits. The objects that feel like a shortcut, like the so-called Tower of Babel stele that shows a staged tower and a plan with an identifying text. If it were perfectly proven and perfectly contextualized, it would be one of those rare gifts where the ancient world almost holds up a picture for you. But because its background and interpretation have been debated, the responsible way to handle it is not to build the entire case on it, but to treat it as a fascinating piece that, at best, aligns with a larger body of evidence that does not depend on it. That's what makes this evidence trail feel different from a simple myth versus history argument. We are not trying to prove a biblical story like a math problem. We're tracing how a real imperial monument, named in local tradition, rebuilt by kings, described by scribes, remembered by outsiders, and measured by archaeology, could become the best candidate for the tower that later storytellers turned into a symbol of human unity, fear, and ambition. And once you see how many independent paths lead back toward the same sacred center in Babylon, the legend starts to feel less like a floating fairy tale and more like a memory that has been sharpened into narrative, the way human beings often turn the biggest things they see into stories that can survive long after the bricks are gone. People always want the number, because the moment you put a number on a legendary tower, it stops being a foggy symbol and becomes something you can picture in your body. Like, would it make my neck hurt to look up at it? Could I see it from miles away? Would it feel like a mountain or just a tall building? With Etemenanki, the honest answer is that we have estimates rooted in ancient descriptions, not a modern surveyor's report. So you handle the figures the way you handle any ancient measurement: useful, suggestive, and never perfectly final. The description most often discussed in scholarship pictures a staged tower with 7 levels and gives dimensions that, when converted, come out to a base and a height on the order of about 90 meters, sometimes summarized as roughly 91 meters high with a square footprint of similar size. That around 90 range is important because it matches the emotional effect the Babel story depends on. In a flat alluvial plain, a structure that size doesn't just stand there, it reorganizes the horizon. Even a much smaller tower can feel enormous in that landscape, but a tower pushing toward that scale would dominate the city the way a cliff dominates a shoreline. It's also worth pausing on the 7 levels, because 7 in the ancient world is rarely just a counting detail. It's a number that carries a sense of completeness, a total set, a cosmic rhythm, and a tower built in 7 rising stages naturally invites people to read it as a model of the world stacked between earth and sky. Whether the tower always had exactly 7 visible stages in every phase of its long life is hard to prove, but the tradition of a 7-tiered structure makes sense as both architecture and symbolism. It gives the monument a clear profile, a step-by-step ascent, and a built-in sense that you are climbing through ordered layers toward a sacred point above ordinary life. Now picture what staged really means in practice. This is not a single thin spire shooting upward. It's a massive terraced form, broad, heavy, and geometric, with each level set back from the one below, creating long platforms and sharp edges that catch light and shadow. You don't build something like that by stacking bricks straight up like a wall. You build it like a landscape. You need ramps or stairways. You need zones where materials can be staged. You need surfaces that can shed water. And you need outer faces that can withstand weather, because mud brick hates neglect. The tower's outer skin mattered as much as its height, because without a protected surface, rain and wind would soften the shape and eat the corners away. That's why fired brick and bitumen show up in the way these monuments are described, because they're not just nice materials, they're survival gear for architecture. And once you imagine the scale and the surfaces, you can start to understand the kind of impression it would make on people who arrived from smaller towns or from regions with different building traditions. The Babel line about it topping the heavens doesn't have to mean a literal attempt to invade God's space. It can be the natural language of astonishment. In a city like Babylon, the sacred center is designed to feel like the center, and a tower like Etemenanki is designed to be seen, to be approached, and to make you feel that you are moving towards something larger than yourself. There's also the question everyone asks next: was it the tallest thing in the ancient world? That's where you have to be careful, because tallest depends on the era and the comparison set. Earlier monuments, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, reached higher than 90 meters, so if someone claims Etemenanki was the tallest structure humans had ever built, that's probably too strong. But you don't need it to be number one on an all-time list to understand its impact. In its region, in its city, and in the lived experience of most people who saw it, it would have felt extreme. It would have been among the most ambitious brick monuments ever attempted, and it would have been one of the most dominating sites in the Mesopotamian world, precisely because it combined height with mass and with sacred meaning. A pyramid is a mountain too, but it belongs to a different landscape and a different ritual world. A ziggurat in Babylon is not a tomb. It's a living, sacred platform tied to festivals, priests, offerings, and royal legitimacy. And that living role changes how the structure is perceived. The how tall question also hides another curiosity. What did it look like? People love to imagine it in color, and that's not a silly instinct, because Babylon's monumental style in the Neo-Babylonian period did use glazed bricks and strong visual patterning in key public spaces, and the city's rulers clearly understood that shine and color are forms of persuasion. With the tower, we should be cautious about claiming every surface was bright blue like a modern illustration, because full-surface glazing on that scale would be a huge undertaking, and the evidence is uneven. But it's still reasonable to picture a monument that was not a dull mud mound. It likely had fired brick facing in important areas, and it belonged to a sacred precinct where presentation mattered, where the city wanted the center to look maintained, intentional, and worthy of the god it served. Even without a fully glazed exterior, the contrast between sunlit brick, dark bitumen seams, shadowed recesses, and the crisp geometry of terraces would have been dramatic, especially at certain times of day when the light turns edges into lines and lines into a kind of silent authority.
And then there's the top, the part that is hardest to pin down and easiest to mythologize. Ziggurats typically culminate in a shrine or temple space, a small sacred house on the highest platform, and in Babylon, that summit would have carried the idea that the god's presence is enthroned above the city. From the ground, the top would appear almost unreal, not because it's floating, but because distance compresses detail. You see the outline, the crown, the final stage, but you can't see the human scale of the doorways or the railings. That visual effect alone can produce the feeling that the structure is touching the sky, because your brain reads top beyond detail as top beyond reach. Now add the social reality of access. Most people would never stroll up to the highest shrine as if it were a public viewpoint. Sacred centers have rules. Certain spaces are restricted. Certain ascents belong to priests, officials, or ritual moments. So the tower's height isn't just physical height, it's controlled height. Height that symbolizes distance from ordinary life and closeness to the divine order the city claims to maintain. That control is part of why the tower becomes such a potent symbol in later storytelling. It doesn't only rise, it separates. It marks who is central and who is peripheral. It gathers the city's meaning into one vertical line. And that line, in an imperial capital, is never innocent. It can be devotion and it can be domination. And in Babylon, those two can exist in the same brick. Finally, a number like 90 meters isn't only about awe, it's about vulnerability. A huge brick monument is always negotiating with gravity, moisture, and time. The larger it is, the more it demands a system to keep it standing, Maintenance crews, replacement bricks, resealed joints, cleared drains, repaired faces, supervised work. When the system weakens, the tower doesn't simply stand there as a dead monument. It begins to decay, and then it becomes a quarry, and then it becomes a mound. So the height, the very thing that makes it unforgettable, also makes it dependent on the city's ongoing power. That's why how tall was Babel is not only a measurement question, it's a story question, because the height is a snapshot of a moment when Babylon could command resources and attention at the highest level, and when the city wanted the world to look up and think, this is the center, this is permanent, this is a name that will last. The tragedy and the fascination is that the name lasted far longer than the bricks ever could.
A monument like Etemenanki doesn't usually end with one clean moment of collapse. It ends the way a great city ends, when its center of gravity moves somewhere else and the repairs stop being worth the cost. After Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon is still Babylon, but the future is no longer guaranteed by a single king's will, and the tower's survival depends on something less dramatic and much harder to sustain: routine maintenance, year after year, in a landscape where water and weather constantly push mud brick back toward earth. The political turning point arrives in 539 BCE, when Cyrus and the Persian forces take Babylon, and from that moment the city is part of a wider imperial system with different priorities. Babylon doesn't vanish overnight, and Persian rule can be pragmatic and even respectful toward local cults in its official language, but a ziggurat is not kept alive by respectful language, it's kept alive by budgets, labor, and a steady administrative habit of keeping the sacred center sharp-edged and sealed. Once that habit weakens, the tower starts to change even if nobody announces it. The outer faces begin to suffer. Water finds the smallest cracks. Wind worries at exposed corners. A staged structure that once looked like geometry against the sky slowly starts to soften, and the difference between a maintained terrace and a slumping mass is not one storm, it's 1,000 small seasons of neglect. Then the most ordinary and most decisive force shows up: reuse. In a world built from brick, old brick is treasure. You don't need to hate a monument to dismantle it, you just need to need its materials more than you need its meaning. People take bricks for houses, for walls, for repairs, for new projects, and each layer removed exposes weaker layers beneath, making the next removal easier and speeding decay. Bitumen can be scraped and repurposed too, and once protective skins are stripped away, a mud brick body deteriorates faster, especially in a city where groundwater and seasonal rain can turn stability into slow collapse. Over time, the tower becomes less of a building and more of a quarry disguised as a ruin, and then less of a quarry and more of a mound. And that transition can happen without any dramatic story attached to it, which is why later generations often imagine a single catastrophe, even when the real process is gradual. The city's own role in the world also shifts. Under later rulers, new administrative centers grow, trade routes change, populations move, and Babylon's ability to command the kind of concentrated labor that keeps a giant staged tower crisp and ceremonial diminishes. By the time Alexander the Great arrives in Babylon in the late 4th century BCE, the tower precinct is already described as being in ruins, and that detail is crucial because it tells you the decline was well underway long before the final centuries finished the job. Alexander's reaction, according to ancient sources, is not just admiration, it's ambition. rebuilding the Great Tower would have been a perfect imperial gesture, a way to claim Babylon's prestige while also presenting himself as the one who can restore what time and conflict had broken. But the first step in rebuilding a monument like this is not design, it's removal. You have to clear an enormous volume of debris, brick by brick, basket by basket, and when you imagine the scale of that labor, you understand why even a conqueror with grand plans could be humbled by the practical reality of starting over. Some traditions suggest clearing work was attempted, and even if the details are uncertain, the basic obstacle is obvious. Restoring a brick mountain means moving a brick mountain before you can even begin to raise new stages. Then Alexander dies in 323 BCE, and the plan loses the one thing a project like this cannot survive without: a ruler who keeps caring. A restoration on that scale requires continuous command, continuous funding, and continuous political motivation, and once the motivation shifts to other cities and other priorities, the half-cleared ruin returns to being a ruin. In the centuries that follow, Babylon remains present in memory and sometimes in habitation, but its monumental heart is no longer the unquestioned stage of world power. The tower continues its long unbuilding, and the word is accurate because what happens is not only decay, but removal, the slow conversion of architecture back into material, and material back into earth. The top disappears first, because it's easiest to strip and hardest to maintain, and what remains is a massive base that still hints at former height, like a shadow that refuses to fully fade. Travelers and writers can still point to the place and speak of what once stood there, and the longer the tower is absent, the more the story begins to fill the absence with meaning. That's the paradox of Etemenanki's fall. The physical tower becomes smaller and smaller in the real world, but larger and larger in the imagination, because ruins invite explanation, and because a great capital losing its great monument feels like a lesson waiting to be told. By the time the structure has been reduced to foundations and uneven ground, the myth has gained its final advantage. It no longer has to match the current skyline. It can describe the tower at its most overwhelming moment, when Babylon had the power to build upward and the confidence to believe that brick could secure a name forever. And when you understand that the tower wasn't simply destroyed, but gradually unmade by shifting empires, by maintenance that stopped, and by bricks carried away into countless smaller lives, the story of Babel becomes even sharper. It isn't only about a grand project failing, it's about how every grand project depends on a living system, and how the moment that system weakens, even the most famous tower in human memory can quietly return to the mud it rose from. Centuries after the tower slipped back into the ground, the search for it became a different kind of story, not about kings and gods, but about trenches, measuring tapes, and the patience to read a city that has been rebuilt on itself again and again. When modern archaeology finally arrived at Babylon in a systematic way in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the central figures was Robert Koldewey, whose long excavation campaign helped map major parts of the ancient city and gave the first clear modern framework for locating the sacred core where the Great Tower was believed to have stood. The strange disappointment many visitors feel today that there is no dramatic stump of a tower to climb is actually the most honest lesson Babylon can teach. In an alluvial landscape built largely from mud brick, the skyline is the first thing to die, and the ground plan is what survives. Fired brick can last, but it gets reused. Mud brick can last, but it demands constant maintenance, and when that stops, it doesn't collapse into neat blocks, it melts into itself. It slumps and spreads, and the clean geometry turns into a mound that looks almost natural unless you know what you're looking at. That's why archaeology at Babylon often feels like learning to see negative space, the footprint of something absent, the thickness of foundations, the outline of massive platforms, the relationship between the tower precinct and the temple complex beside it, and the way the city's sacred center was engineered as a whole environment rather than a single isolated object. Koldewey and later researchers worked with that reality, tracing walls and corners that are easy to miss if you expect the tower to still be standing, and interpreting features like deep foundation cuts and waterlogged areas that hint at the engineering problem every builder in Babylon faced from the start. You are stacking a mountain of brick on ground that lives close to water. Reports from the site describe substantial foundation features and a large, wet trench-like area associated with the tower's base system. And even if details of interpretation can vary, the basic impression is consistent. Building upward here required fighting moisture below, and that battle leaves scars in the soil long after the upper stages are gone. Archaeology also forces humility on the story, because Babylon is not a single moment frozen in time. Later occupation, stone and brick robbing, seasonal flooding, and earlier digs all disturbed the layers, which means every line in the ground is an argument that has to be tested, not a simple reveal. And yet, even with those complications, the essential thing becomes visible: the scale. You can stand on the site and feel how much space the tower demanded, how wide the base had to be, how the sacred center was laid out, and how a monument like Etemenanki could dominate imagination even after the last visible height was stripped away. In a way, that's the perfect ending to the physical search, because it flips the myth into a new kind of proof. The legend is vertical, a tower reaching into the heavens, but archaeology confirms the monument through the horizontal facts that don't flatter the imagination. The size of the footprint, the depth of the foundations, the geometry of the precinct, and the stubborn reality that something enormous once stood here. When you see that, the story becomes harder to dismiss as pure fantasy, not because archaeology proves a theological scene, but because it shows the world that scene is drawn from, a real city with real monumental towers and a real sacred center where the idea of Babel could take root and survive long after the bricks returned to dust. The most famous part of the Babel story isn't the tower, it's what happens to speech. One moment the world has one language, the next it doesn't, and the collapse of communication is what actually kills the project. It's a brilliant narrative move because it takes something invisible, language, and turns it into the strongest force on the construction site. You can break tools and still rebuild. You can lose a ramp and still haul bricks another way. But if the command becomes noise, if the measurement is misunderstood, if the plan can't be explained, the whole machine freezes. That's the human reality the story captures in a single sudden stroke. But if we step carefully into what scholars can say about language history, the picture gets more complicated and, in a way, more revealing. Historical linguistics doesn't support the idea of one global human language that shattered overnight into unrelated families. The evidence suggests languages change gradually. They drift as communities split and as dialects gain distance. They borrow from neighbors when people trade, intermarry, or live under the same state. Over generations, sound changes stack up. Grammar bends, new slang becomes normal speech, and a shared tongue becomes several tongues without anyone waking up to a single before and after morning. This is why linguists can trace broad relationships like the Indo-European family, where patterns in vocabulary and structure point to deep common ancestry, while still recognizing that many other language families developed along different paths. So if Genesis is not a literal timeline of linguistic evolution, what is it doing? One answer is that it's using language as the ultimate symbol of human unity and human limits, because nothing binds a group together faster than shared speech, and nothing fractures a group more efficiently than misunderstanding. Mesopotamia itself makes that symbol feel grounded. This region was multilingual for a very long time. Sumerian and Akkadian lived side by side in complex ways, sometimes with scribes trained to read and write both, sometimes with everyday speech diverging from elite writing. Later, Aramaic becomes widely used as a practical language across large empires, and later still, Greek enters the region's administrative and cultural life. Babylon, especially at its peak, was built to be a magnet. People came for trade, people came for administration, people came as soldiers, people came as pilgrims. People came because empires moved them, relocating communities like resources. The result is not a tidy bilingual city, but a soundscape of accents, borrowed words, and constant translation. In a place like that, confusion of tongues doesn't need to be a miracle to feel real. Picture the front gate on a busy day. Guards demanding names, merchants arguing over fees, scribes writing receipts, porters hauling loads, and everyone trying to make themselves understood with whatever language mix they have. Picture a market where prices are shouted, deals are made, insults fly, prayers are murmured, and the same object has different names depending on who points at it. Picture a construction crew on a state project where some workers share the local tongue, others know only a trade pidgin, some understand commands by repetition rather than grammar, and supervisors rely on gestures and routines when words fail. Miscommunication doesn't have to be total to be dangerous. A single misunderstood instruction can waste a day. A single dispute over a word can turn into blame. Over time, the stress of coordination becomes part of the city's lived texture. This is why many researchers read Babel as a theological portrait of empire rather than a scientific claim about how languages originated. In the story, unity is total, one people, one voice, one plan, and the intervention targets the exact thing that makes such unity possible: shared meaning. God doesn't destroy the bricks, He disrupts comprehension, and the project dies because coordination dies. That makes the punishment, if you want to call it that, oddly modern in its realism. It's not about the limits of muscle, it's about the limits of complex systems. Once communication breaks, the system breaks. There's also a literary signal in the Hebrew that shows the author is shaping meaning through language, not only reporting an event. The name Babel in Mesopotamian usage is often connected to the idea of the gate of God, a proud sacred claim, while Genesis links Babel to a Hebrew verb, balal, meaning to mix or to confuse, turning a prestigious city name into a pun about disorder. That doesn't function like a modern etymological argument, but it tells you what the writer is doing, flipping the city's self-image. A place that claims to be a gate between worlds becomes, in the story, the place where human speech turns into a tangle. And notice the kind of tragedy the story chooses. Language diversity itself is not presented as evil. What's tragic is the collapse of a shared project built on uniformity. The moment when the crowd can no longer coordinate and the dream of a single centralized center fails. In real Babylon, empires didn't collapse just because people spoke different languages. They managed multilingualism through scribal schools, official languages, translators, and bureaucratic routines. But that management also turns language into power. If one language becomes the language of orders and contracts, then those who don't command it are always vulnerable. If scribes control the scripts, they become gatekeepers. If the ruler's speech and the worker's speech aren't the same, misunderstanding becomes political. So the Babel story can be heard as a compressed critique of centralized ambition. You can gather people from everywhere, you can build high, you can try to fix identity in one place, but you cannot guarantee one voice forever. Differences surface, meanings drift, trust fractures, and when the shared voice breaks, the tower, no matter how tall, stops rising. In that sense, the story isn't mainly trying to explain why French and Chinese exist. It's using language as the deepest symbol of human plurality, the stubborn fact that people can stand in the same street and still live in different worlds of meaning. The tower is the visible image, but the real drama is invisible, happening between mouths and ears. And once you see Babylon as a real multilingual capital, the myth starts to feel less like a random fairy tale and more like a sharp narrative drawn from life. Build any world center you want, but the moment understanding fails, everything stops. Even after the tower itself was unmade, the story kept traveling. And that's one of the most revealing parts of the whole saga, because it shows what humans choose to carry forward when the bricks are gone. The Babel story didn't survive because people had a postcard of the ziggurat. It survived because it fit into larger memories and larger anxieties, especially the memory of Babylon as an imperial center that could pull whole populations into its orbit. For Jewish communities shaped by exile and empire, Babylon was not only a location, it was an experience, a place where power felt absolute and where identity could feel threatened. So a story about a city that tries to lock humanity into one name and one project naturally gained extra charge. Over time, the tower became a kind of mental shorthand. It could stand for pride, yes, but also for the seduction of centralized order, the dream that if everyone speaks the same way and works on the same monument, history can be controlled. That's why later interpretations often lean on the tower as a warning, but not always in the same way. Some readings focus on arrogance, the idea that humans try to rise too high and get humbled. Other readings focus on coercion and uniformity, the idea that forced sameness is fragile and that scattering can be a kind of release. And some readings see the story as a commentary on technology and collective power, not because the ancient author had modern machines in mind, but because the story captures the feeling of a society discovering what it can do when it moves as one. The tower also becomes a visual object in the imagination long after its real shape is forgotten. Medieval and later art often depicts it as a spiraling or ringed structure, more like a gigantic corkscrew than a Mesopotamian ziggurat, because artists weren't trying to reconstruct Babylonian architecture, they were trying to draw the feeling of dizzying ambition. The point of those images is not accuracy, it's moral drama, a building that looks almost impossible, crowded with workers, reaching upward until it seems to twist the sky. In literature and everyday speech, Babel becomes a word for noise, confusion, a city of overlapping voices, and that linguistic afterlife is almost ironic, because the story that explains confusion ends up giving its name to confusion itself. But the afterlife isn't only negative. The story also made people think about the beauty and difficulty of diversity. If languages multiply, then translation becomes a craft and listening becomes a discipline. In some later religious interpretations, the scattering at Babel is contrasted with moments of renewed understanding, not as a return to forced uniformity, but as the possibility of connection across difference. Even outside theology, the Babel motif keeps showing up whenever humans confront the limits of communication, empires struggling to govern many peoples, cities absorbing migrants, large organizations trying to coordinate across cultures, or simply the everyday frustration of two people using the same words to mean different things. The tower remains useful because it's simple. A single monument stands in for a whole system, unity, ambition, power, and the fragile thread of shared meaning that makes any large project possible. And the story stays flexible because it doesn't lock itself into technical details. It gives you a city, a tower, a crowd, and a fracture, and those elements can be mapped onto many eras without needing to change the plot. Meanwhile, the historical tower behind the legend, Etemenanki, becomes more and more ghost-like as time goes on, present in scholarship, in inscriptions, in excavation reports, but absent from the skyline that once made it famous. That gap, the absence of the physical tower and the presence of the story, is part of why Babel feels eternal. A tower made of mud brick is mortal. A story made of language can travel across continents and centuries. In the end, that's the real afterlife. The monument is gone, but its meaning keeps being rebuilt, not by kings with bricks, but by ordinary people trying to explain why human cooperation is so powerful and why it so often breaks in the space between one mouth and another. When you put all the pieces back on the table, the Tower of Babel stops looking like a single strange fairy tale and starts looking like a story with two layers that keep feeding each other. One layer is the text of Genesis, a compact narrative about unity, fear, and limits, where humans try to secure a name and avoid scattering by building a city and a tower, and the project fails when shared speech breaks. The other layer is the real Mesopotamian world behind the imagery, a flat river plain where cities really did build staged brick mountains, where ziggurats rose as sacred centers, and where Babylon's greatest tower, Etemenanki, stood at the heart of an imperial capital that drew in people from many lands. The story doesn't become a modern eyewitness report just because archaeology exists, and it doesn't need to. What changes is that the myth gains a landscape, a technology, and a plausible monument that explain why the image is so convincing. Brick and bitumen stop being decorative details and start sounding like a real building culture. Shinar stops being a vague name and starts pointing toward a world where urban life was a new kind of force. A tower with its top in the heavens stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding like what a person might say after seeing a sacred mountain rise above an engineered city. And when you follow the historical thread, you see why the tower's biography matters. It was damaged and rebuilt in a world of empires. It became an imperial statement under Nebuchadnezzar's program of restoration. It declined not in one explosion, but through the slow unbuilding that happens when maintenance stops and bricks get reused. It lingered as a ruin famous enough that Alexander could dream of rebuilding it, and then it sank into the ground until archaeology had to prove it through footprints instead of height. Yet the story outlived all of that. It outlived kings who stamped their names into bricks. It outlived the city that made the tower its center. It outlived the empires that fought over the plain. And the reason it outlived them is that it expresses something permanent about human life. People want to gather and build, and they want the build to mean something, to become a name that won't disappear. They also want control, the sense that if the system is big enough, if the monument is high enough, the future can be held in place. The story pushes back on that dream by pointing to a limit that isn't only gravity or weather. The limit is shared meaning. The moment understanding fails, the project fails, even if the bricks are still stacked and the ramps still stand. In that sense, the confusion of tongues is not just a mythic explanation for linguistic diversity, it's a symbol of how fragile coordination can be when it depends on perfect sameness, and how quickly unity can break when words stop landing the same way in different ears. That's why Babel remains useful. It can be read as a warning about pride, a critique of centralized power, a meditation on technology, or simply a haunting portrait of miscommunication turning into scattering. And the final irony is quiet but sharp. The monument was made of mud brick and could not last, but the story is made of language, and language is exactly what the story says can both unite us and divide us. The tower disappeared, but the name survived. And in the end, it's the name, not the bricks, that reached farther than anyone who built the tower could have imagined. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.